Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'nasan Lanu Es Taraso Baruch Atah Adonai Nosein HaTorah Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right, so we are finishing off the book of Ruth that we've been doing for a while. And it's a very exciting thing to be at the end and concluding something. I feel very accomplished. You know, it's a whole book. It's one of the 24 books of the scriptures of Tanakh. So it's very nice to know that we actually learned it in a very, very, solid, real fashion that you have, for those of you that were here for all the classes. Otherwise, you could go on the YouTube channel to catch what you missed. We have a whole book of scriptures, a whole book of Tanakh that we learned solidly. So what we were saying is at the very end of the book, we were saying, okay, so Ruth and Boaz get married. That's the culmination. That's the where this whole story has been leading to. The seed of Lot, that energy that was implanted in Lot, implanted in this. Lot was such a great person, and then in this horrific nation of Moab, but it kept going through the generations. That's godly energy. So it came to Ruth, and she extracted it. And then we have the energy of Yehuda and Tamar that went through Peretz, that went through Nachshon ben Aminadav, that came to Boaz. And these energies come together in this one night of their marriage. And this amazing child is born named Ovid. Ovid meaning a servant of God. He was a complete, pure servant of God. And he had a son named Yishai, who he said was so great that says he only died because of the bite of the snake, of the primordial sin. Otherwise, he didn't deserve to die. He was so, so perfect. And Yishai had a son, his seventh son, named David, who was a king from whom came the entire Davidic reign, the whole energy of David that ultimately culminated in the Davidic king Mashiach. So from Boaz and Ruth to David to Mashiach. But we're saying, but people like to wag their tongues. People like to talk bad. People more enjoy talking bad than talking good sometimes. So we said when Boaz passed away that night, people said, oh, we know why he passed away. And then Ovid, who was so perfect, and Yishai, who was so perfect, there were still people that were saying, oh, I don't know if they're so kosher. I don't know if Ruth was so kosher. Even though they see how holy Ruth is, and they see how holy Ovid is, and they see how holy Yishai is, so it's a little weird to think all these very holy people are not really Jewish or not really fit Jews. But people like to talk sometimes. But most of the talk sort of died down because people saw how holy Ruth and Ovid and Yishai are, so come on. But then we said, and this is the point we were up to last week, now we have David, who's young, but he has already been anointed by the prophet Samuel. And if you remember, again, part of the same journey is that David wasn't considered so worthy. And Yishai and his 6 other sons didn't really appreciate David. They viewed him as like, whatever, the kid that's the shepherd, not like one of us. And then when Samuel came and God said, not this one, 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 not this one. He's like, but you said it's Yishai's son. I went through all 6 of his sons. He said, Yishai, do you have another son? David? Let's see him. And we said the oil jumped out of the horn to anoint his head. So at that point, Yishai and his sons got the specialness of David, but nobody else knew. So David's out in the fields, composing psalms, nobody knows about it, defeating bears and lions with his hands, nobody knows about it, being so righteous and godly, no one knows about it. And now comes this big war. King Saul and the Jewish people against the Philistines, the Plishtim, the Philistines, and they have this huge giant Goliath that's terrifying everyone. And every day he comes out and he's blaspheming the Jewish people and blaspheming God. And everyone's scared to fight him. And he says, And when David comes, he's not even a soldier. He's too young to be a soldier. And he comes to bring food to his brothers who are the soldiers. And he sees what's going on. He says, if no one's going to stand up to this guy, I will. He was fearless with his slingshot, with 5 rocks. He was going to go to fight this giant. And we said, Saul said, well, let me give you my armor, at least to protect you. The best armor of the camp of Israel is the armor of the king. And we said Saul was head and shoulders bigger than everyone. David's little and a kid. He's a little kid. And Saul's armor fit perfectly. So Saul already was like, uh-oh. Like, I wanted, of course, he was very glad David was fighting Goliath because, I mean, this is total embarrassment to the Jewish people that this giant is blaspheming God and the Jews every day, and the Jews are too scared to do anything. So that's like a big embarrassment. And of course, he wanted someone to fight Goliath. But at the same time, he was nervous that his armor, that's obviously far bigger in size than David, fits David perfectly. He understood that was an omen, which it was. So he said to his advisors, this is the point we were up to last week. He said to his advisors, David's from Judah. He knew the kings were supposed to come from Judah. Saul was not from Judah. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. But it was known, I mean, it's clearly written in the Torah that the kings are coming from Judah. So he knew he wasn't the real king, and he'd already been told his kingdom was being ripped away from him. So which side of Judah is David from? Because Judah had 2 both righteous, holy sons from Tamar. You know, it was Judah and Tamar were producing the line of kings. There was the firstborn was Peretz, and the second twin was Zerach. And they were both very holy, both completely holy. But it was known by those that know that Peretz was going to be the line of kings. So Judah and Tamar together produced Peretz, from whom came Aminadab, Nachshon, Boaz. So he says, so he knows David is from Judah, but he doesn't know if within Judah which line. So he says to his advisors, as they're watching this little kid wear armor perfectly fitting and going with his slingshot to fight a giant, and Saul says to his advisors, you know which son of Judah David's descended from? Meaning, is he from Peretz? I'm really in trouble, because that's the line of kings. And look at this kid, my armor fits him, and he's fighting the giant. Uh-oh, he's probably going to take away my kingship. But if he's from Zerah, okay, he's holy. He's so holy that God's making this great miracle for him. He's so holy, he's fearless. He's so holy, my armor fits. But I'm relaxed, because I know Zerah isn't the line of kings. So that's what he was saying to his advisors. Now, one of his advisors, this was the moment we came to, one of his advisors was named Doeg the Adomi. Now, Doeg the Adomi was very brilliant, and on the inside, very rotten. But people didn't realize that, because he was really, really, really smart. He was one of the greatest scholars of that time. He was the head of the court system, of the Sanhedrin, of the highest court of the land of 71. He was a close friend of Saul. He was an advisor of Saul. So everyone thought he's really like, I mean, he's such a brilliant Torah scholar. He must be very, very righteous. But he wasn't. He was a brilliant, twisted man. So on the outside, everyone thinks he's like so righteous. On the inside, he was completely rotten. And this Doeg appears several times in the story of David and Saul, and his rottenness shows more and more and more. This is the first time we see an encounter. This is really the first time we see this potential clash between Saul and David. And Doeg said, instead of asking which son of Judah does he come from, meaning is he from the line of kings Peretz, or is he from the illustrious but not line of kings Zerah, you should ask whether he's worthy to enter the congregation of God. He's a descendant of Rus, the Moabite. So what was Doeg insinuating here? He was saying, he's not even a kosher Jew. You're worried, is he going to be the next king? Maybe on his ancestor Boaz's side, you know, he comes from the line of Peretz. And he actually does. But who cares? That line got defiled. because Boaz married Ruth, and he shouldn't have done that. Ruth is a Moabite. You know, Moabites can't marry. They could be converts, they could be Jews, but they can't marry regular Jews. So Ruth and Boaz's marriage wasn't kosher. I know Boaz was very great, but whatever. He was confused. He was in his very, very old age. He messed up. And I know their son Oved, like he seemed very holy, but he's not kosher. And I know his son Yisra, he's around nowadays. Everyone thinks he's, oh my gosh, so holy. He seems holy. He's not kosher. And David, he's not kosher. So he can't be the king. He's not even a kosher Jew. That's what this Doeg said. So this is 4 generations later. I mean, we have Ruth and Boaz, then Oved, then Yishai. Now we have David, right? And at this point, Doeg, who was so evil and rotten and trying to destroy the godliness that was supposed to emerge here, and was trying to implant in Saul's head a lot of negative feelings toward David, which he did very well, he's making allegations against David's very status as a kosher fit Jew. Now, again, they're not alone, Saul and Doeg talking. I said Saul was with his advisors. So another great person that we will see later in the story figures very significantly. There was a lot going on in David and Saul and the dynamics between them. A lot of stuff happened. This is the very beginning of a short but very intense saga. So Abner, who was Saul's chief general, and he, in the beginning, was a proponent of Saul, but later, in the end, he switched to David's side, and that's much later, way after Saul passed away, 7 years later. But in the end, actually, Abner is the one that works to get David the throne, but that's many years later. But at this moment already, Abner is showing what will ultimately be his loyalty, again, many years later, because originally Abner was not loyal to David, but in the end, he became a very big adherent of David. So Abner said, what are you talking about, Doeg? Are you crazy? It's not that Boaz was old and confused and made a mistake. The court of Boaz taught, it wasn't Boaz, this was his whole court. He was the head of the court. Talking about 71 sages. The court of Boaz taught that when the Torah says the Moabite cannot enter the congregation of the Jews, cannot marry a Jew, it only means the men. And not only did the court of Boaz teach this original teaching that had become lost over time, but the greatest court after Boaz is the current court, the court of Samuel. Right? Samuel was the greatest of all of these leaders of the Jews at this time, the judges. He was the greatest, the final, and the greatest judge. And the court of Samuel reenacted the same ruling. So the court of Boaz, before Boaz and Ruth got married, before that was on the table, the court of Boaz said a Moabite convert who's a woman is allowed to marry a Jew. It's only a Moabite convert who's a man who's not allowed to marry a Jew. And now, in our times, we don't have to look back, 100 some years. In our times, the court of Samuel taught the same thing. It's only Moabite men. It has nothing to do with Moabite women. So, of course, David is completely kosher. Of course, he's completely legitimate. So that's what Abner said. So Doeg, and remember, I told you Doeg was very rotten and very brilliant. He was very twisted. He was very evil, but people at the time didn't realize he was evil because he covered it over so well with this veneer of scholarship that people didn't realize he was really, really, really evil. So Doeg fought back intellectually. Doeg argued back. And they were going back and forth and back and forth. But Doeg said, in the meanwhile, this is, while the famous story of David and Goliath and the slingshot is happening, this is what's happening by Saul. People focus on David and Goliath, and that was very important, but this is what's happening by Saul. This is also pretty important. So Doeg fights back against Abner, and Doeg was very brilliant. So Doeg brought so many proofs, As we say, he made up this whole concoction. It's not true at all, but he sounded really, really good because he was really smart and really clever. So he could pull all these things together and sound really right, even though he was completely wrong. So nobody knew what to say. Like, they knew David was legitimate because Boaz's court declared it and Samuel's court declared it. So how could Doeg be going against these courts? Who is he? Even though he's the head of the court system, he can't just on his own say, oh, the court of Boaz was wrong. Oh, the court of Samuel was wrong. I know what's right. But he sounded really good. So finally, someone else who plays later in the story as well, Amasa, the son of Yisra, nobody could answer Doeg. He was too smart, but they knew he was wrong, and they knew it sounded very corrupt to go against the courts of Samuel and Boaz. So Amasa, the son of Yisra, got up and he said, whoever refuses to acknowledge this law will be stabbed with my sword. Like, that's it, guys. The end of the conversation. This I have learned from the court of Samuel, a Moabite, but not a woman Moabite. So that ended the conversation because people do that. Amasa meant it. He was saying basically, guys, I don't care how smart you are, Doeg. I don't care how smart you sound. I don't care how convincing you sound. In the end of the day, you're arguing against our tradition, against Torah as it's been handed down for these generations. If the court of Boaz said it, that's enough for us. And I heard it personally from the court of Samuel. That's enough. I don't care how smart you sound. I don't care how convincing you sound. I know you're wrong. And that's it. We're not debating anymore. We're not engaging anymore. We're not giving you any space to sound so right. Done. If you continue saying it, I'm pulling out my sword. Which is a very interesting lesson this Amasa is teaching us. Again, he also figures later in the story with David and Saul, but not to go into what's going to happen later. A very interesting lesson, because he's really saying that sometimes evil can sound really good. It could sound right. It could sound smooth. It could sound slick. It could sound true. It could be quoting Torah. But if you know it's wrong, it's wrong. Don't engage in it. Don't debate it. Don't weigh it in your head. It's wrong. Like, just pull out your sword. It's wrong. Now, how did he know this? How did he know Doeg was wrong when Doeg was the most learned person and the smartest person and the slickest person, and nobody knew at that time how evil he was? How did Amasa realize this? He said, very simple. This is what the court said. This is God's system. God's system is the courts are determining for us the law. So if the courts of Boaz determine this law, the court of Samuel determined this law, that's God's verdict. And Doeg, you're arguing against this legal determination. That's wrong. He might not have known exactly how evil Doeg was at the time, but he knew this was 100% wrong. You can't argue against the courts. You can't, like, if someone will come today and say, oh, I'm smarter than anyone that came before me. So everyone that came before me didn't know what they were talking about because I'm smarter, so I can revisit law with my much smarter eye. You're never allowed to do that. Whatever came before, we accept. As closer to God than us, as closer to the giving of the Torah than us, we're 3,333 years later. And that's why it's always been this way. That whatever was said by a previous sage is always revered by a later sage because they're a step closer to Sinai. They're a step closer to the giving of the Torah. We can wonder how it applies in current situations. We can try to figure that out. We can debate against our peers, but we can't argue a ruling from a previous time because they're closer to Sinai than we are. We trust they know the truth. That's how Torah works. That's the system. So you're going against the system. You sound smart. You sound convincing. You sound like you're right, but I know you're wrong. I don't know if anyone here has experienced that, but I think it's an experience that I've definitely feel I've experienced. And I think, sometimes we just have to look at the basic foundational premise. And if the foundational premise is being violated, it doesn't make a difference how convincing the person sounds. Done. We don't listen. We don't engage. They could be much smarter than us. They could prove everything beautifully, but it doesn't make a difference. I know they're violating this foundational premise. I know I can't even listen to them. That's what Amasa said. We're not engaging. I can't engage with you. No point. I'm gonna pull out my sword because you're violating how Torah is transmitted from generation to generation. If you decide you're smarter than all the courts, this is a violation of the transmittance of Torah. So that was how that argument, that questioning of David's legitimacy ended. Because Amasa said, I believe in tradition. I believe in Torah as it's handed from generation to generation. I believe in the court system that we have. I believe in God's system. And all of that says David is 100% legitimate. Now, unfortunately, Doeg did not rest. And throughout the entire reign of Saul, which was very short, in totality, he ruled 2 years, he was David's nemesis. He was always trying to inflame Saul against David. In other words, unfortunately, Saul got in his head that David was trying to usurp him, was trying to take over the throne. But Doeg kept inflaming him. So each time when he sort of came to accept David's righteousness and David's innocence, Doeg was again there to convince Saul that he has to kill David. David's a rebel. That's what Torah says. And again, unfortunately, Doeg caused a lot of trouble. And that's also, I think, a very strong lesson here. How, sorry for all my various phones in the background. It's a strong lesson here how someone could seemingly be knowledgeable, quotes Torah fluently, glibly, smart, super smart. But that doesn't mean he's godly. And if what he's saying with all of his smartness and knowledge is against the principles of Torah, you don't have to be as smart as him. You don't have to be able to argue with him. You know he's wrong. And of course, we have that today as well. People that represent lots of false ideologies, false belief systems, and they can sound really good, but they're going against Torah, so we know they're wrong. However good they sound, if they're going against Torah, they're wrong. So we don't need to engage. We don't need to filter it out. We don't need to wonder. They're going against Torah. They can't be right. They're wrong. But as long as Doeg was alive, there always were these whispers against David. He's not even really a fit Jew. Now, Doeg actually did not live a very long life. He died when he was 33. He managed to do a lot of damage before he died. But at the end of the day, he died in complete disgrace. He died and everyone knew his evil. But then everyone knew his evil. Everyone rejected him for his evil. Everyone knew he wasn't a Torah scholar. He was a fabrication of a Torah scholar. Because if you know all this Torah, but you're not really believing in God, all of your scholarship is actually wrong. It's actually being used as a perversion, which was what Doeg's was. But until he died, which was a few years later, at 33, he continued and continued and continued to try to destroy David, because David represented godliness, and that's what Doeg was fighting against. Menucha? Menucha, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Why David was disrespected in his own family? Like the older brothers, he was not even invited when Samuel came over to anoint the king. Can you explain?
I could. It's a long story, but I can explain it. I wasn't going to go there just because it's long, but it's part of the whole, part of this whole concept of, again, this very powerful light coming through the back doors. So what happened was like this. David's father was Yishai. Yishai was the son of Oved, who was the son of Rus and Boaz. We all know this very well. We know this book really well. I feel very good that we've mastered this book as much as one can in our classes. Oved was very holy. Yishai was even holier. Again, he's listed as the 5 people the Talmud lists as someone so holy, he shouldn't even have died. It's just because of this primordial sin. Now, Yishai had 6 sons with his wife. And as I said, there was always this little whisper in the background about Ruth being from Moab, and even though Boaz's court said it was kosher, there were always those people that were doubting it, which is why Samuel's court, now again, that's in, so to speak, modern times, the times when this story is currently taking place with David, Samuel's court reaffirmed this ruling. Why they have to reaffirm it? Boaz's court said it, because there were always people that were doubting it. So Yishai, who was very righteous, very, very holy, he thought, maybe I'm not a legitimate Jew. I don't know. I mean, my grandfather Boaz was the head of the rabbinical court. Surely he knew what he ruled. My father Ovid is so holy, but I'm getting nervous. Like he was nervous as a very God-fearing woman. He was nervous. What if I'm really not? And he thought, well, if I'm not really a legitimate Jew, what would I do differently? What's different in my life? Because maybe I am a legitimate Jew. So obviously I'm going to keep all of the commandments, but maybe I'm not. So like, he sort of made himself crazy, if you will. Like I can understand that, like very religious. So you're sort of third guessing yourself. So he said, well, what would be different? Well, I said, the only difference would be my marriage. Because if I'm not a legitimate Jew, I'm not allowed to be married to my wife. But in every other aspect of my life, there's no difference. So obviously, in other words, a Moabite convert is still Jewish. So obviously everything continues, but I don't know if my marriage is right. So because he was so like worrying about this point, and obviously this was part of the whole setup of the story, because this is how David was supposed to endure his childhood. That's why obviously God created this like fear in Yishai's brain. So Yishai said, you know what I'm going to do? Just to be extra careful, I'm going to separate from my wife. Now, I'm not divorcing her. Obviously, no one's going to know. It's not a shame to her. She's a wonderful woman. She's a very, very, very holy woman, actually. But what if it's nothing against her, but what if I'm not allowed to be married to her? So fine. He separated from his wife. Nobody knew, just the two of them, just him and his wife. Nobody else knew about it. It was very quiet. I assume he explained to her why. And that was it. And his wife, though, who was also very, very, very holy, obviously it was appropriate wife for such a holy man as Yishai. So his wife knew with prophetic spirit that David's supposed to be born. And she understood this was a plot, in a sense, of the forces of evil to prevent David's birth, because he can't be born because her husband separated from her and he wasn't born yet. So she's like, no, I have to produce this child. I know he's supposed to be born. But what am I going to do? My husband just doesn't, he's just too holy and too nervous, and he's not going to have relationships with me. So what Yishai had done at that time, which again is not something we would do today, but at that time was allowed, was he had like what's called a concubine. That she was, it's a complicated halachic legal thing to explain, but he knew he would be allowed to have relationships with her. So this was David's mother's maid. So one night, when David's mother knew would be a time she could become pregnant, she switched places with the maid. Yishai didn't realize. She became pregnant that night. She gives birth to David. Now, Yishai knows what's going on. Here's my very, very, very holy wife, but how did she get pregnant? It can't really be my child. But on the other hand, she's a very holy woman. But on the other hand, how could this be my child? So he just didn't do anything about it, because anyway, he wasn't having relationships with his wife, so what difference does it make? He did nothing about it, but in his head, he never really viewed David as his child. And that's why he raised him in that fashion. He wasn't mean to him, obviously. He's a very saintly person, but he didn't treat him like he treated his other sons as his children. And that's why David sort of grew up, and his mother knew he was legitimate. His mother always sort of whispered that message to him. But from his father, now obviously the six sons, his six older brothers didn't know the whole backstory, but somehow they picked up the father didn't hold of David that much. So they also didn't hold of David that much. So David was like out in the fields with the sheep, not being abused in any way, but not being treated like the other brothers.
Yeah, but why the wife?
And that was exactly how God wanted it, because that was part of his journey, was to be raised that way.
Why the wife couldn't tell the truth?
Why couldn't she say what happened?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know if she tried. All I know is what's written. Everything I just told you was written. That's where I got it from. I didn't make any of it up. But I don't know if she tried, if she wouldn't hear it, if he thought at this point, I can't believe it because it's sus. He probably, this is my assumption, but this is a pure assumption. She probably did tell him, and he probably thought, I'm not allowed to believe it because she could just be saying this to defend herself. So how do I know if she's right or not? Like, and I can't ask the maid because obviously it's her maid. She'll vouch for her story. How do I know? But again, he didn't do anything in either direction. He didn't do anything against his wife because how do I know? And since we're not anyway having relationships, it doesn't really make a difference, so to speak. But at the same time, how do I know it's right? When did Yishai buy the story?
When David became a king.
No,
right?
David became king many, many years later. When do you think Yishai bought the story?
When Sam came over and anointed
exactly.
as
When
a king.
when David was anointed, he realized, oh, he really is my child. And I really am legitimate. In other words, it was like a double message to Yishai. Because at that moment, remember, Yishai doesn't bring David. He brings the other 6 boys for this party that was a ploy. In other words, Samuel couldn't say, I'm coming to anoint the next king. Saul is the king. This would be considered, a death penalty issue. Samuel knew and Saul knew that God took the kingship away from him, but Saul was still the king, and you can't go. Even when God told Samuel, go anoint one of the sons of Yishai as king, Samuel said, I'll get killed. Like, how do I go? What should I do? And God said, figure it out, figure out a ploy. So when Samuel came with this ploy of we're going to have a feast, which was, again, this great honor for Yishai, that the spiritual head of the Jewish people was coming to him, and bring your sons, he didn't even think about David. He brought his 6 sons. Then secretly there, Samuel says, this is about anointing the next king. And all of Yishai's sons were completely righteous. They were all tzaddikim. They all wore tefillin all day long. They were all 100% righteous. And none of them was anointed. And Samuel said, do you have another kid? He's like, oh, David? Maybe. And then when they call in David, and the oil literally jumps out of the horn to come on David's forehead, jumps out to anoint itself on David. And when it came on David, it says that it hardened and glistened like pearls and jewels. So it was so obvious to everyone in the room, which was Samuel, Yishai, and the 6 other boys, that this is legit. He's the next king of the Jewish people. Then Yishai realized, A, he's my child, and B, I'm legitimate. Because obviously, if David's the next king of the Jewish people, he's legitimate. And if he's legitimate, that means I'm legitimate. So that's when Yishai accepted it, by this tremendous overt sign from God. But until then, he didn't know. He wasn't sure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I just didn't go into it because there's so many details, but again, it shows both David's soul having to come in this backhanded way. And I think it also shows maybe just on a very human level, this is just my speculation, could be totally wrong, but I'm thinking maybe it was just to give David the enormous sensitivity he had. Do you know what I mean? When you're raised in that way, it probably makes you a little more sensitized to other people and their pain than if he wasn't raised with that baggage. So maybe that was also part of God's plans. But I know it was all from God. We're dealing with very holy, very righteous people here, that anything they were doing was, there was nothing wrong in any of the things they did. And it was, in other words, sometimes, obviously, everything is from God. But when you're dealing with such holy people, and they would come to this whole situation, obviously God, on one hand, is bringing David through that back door again. But I think it probably also had to do perhaps with David himself and the sensitivity he developed, as you see so clearly in the Psalms and in all of his behaviors. So that was David, and that was how David ultimately, as I'm saying, well, as you see from my answer to Menucha, even Yishai perhaps sort of bought this storyline, like, I don't know if I'm legitimate. And really, 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 it took years. It took until Doeg died before the Jewish people completely dropped this allegation against David. And then again, it took a long time till David became the king. He was anointed by Samuel, and people even knew he was anointed. But still, after the passing of Saul, it took 7 more years after Saul passed away until David was accepted as king. For 7 years, David ruled only his own tribe, the tribe of Judah. They accepted him as king. And everybody knew that Samuel appointed him. Everyone knew he was anointed. But still, there was some tremendous resistance in the people to accepting David as king. And 7 years after the passing of Saul, as I said, I mentioned Avner, the general of Saul, who initially was supporting Saul and supporting Saul's family and Saul's successor, Ishbosheth. But in the end, Avner was the one that switched camps to David's side for a whole other story I'm not going to go into. All these things are long, detailed stories. But in the end, 7 years later, Avner switched to David's camp, and Avner went around promoting David as king, promoting the people to accept David. And that's when the Jewish people accepted David and came to David and asked him, accepted his sovereignty. Of course, this is a whole process of a king being king, is that the people accept him as king. Our sages say there's no king without a people, which is a true statement in terms of God as the king of the world. And that's why every year in Rosh Hashanah, when we blow the shofar, that's our way of accepting God as our king. And without our acceptance of God as our king, we're told he wouldn't be king. Because even God, he's a creator, but to be king, he needs a people that are accepting him. And so too with all human kings from a Jewish perspective. So David was king, not when God anointed him through Samuel. That didn't make him king. Not with the death of Saul. That didn't make him king. He was king over the Jews when the Jews accepted him as king. There's no king without a people. Just same idea, of course, now in accepting Mashiach. How does Mashiach get the crown? When the people turn, when the people accept him. That's always been the process in Judaism for the king. There's no king without a people. And even after the Jews accepted David, and he was king of the Jews, he still did not have he had a very, very, very hard life. With a lot of challenges, with a lot of difficult situations. You could even just read in the English, the prophets, Kings 1 and Kings 2, if you have it with the Midrash says, so you get the complete storyline. I mean, not the complete storyline, but at least the basic storyline. Very difficult. But with all of his challenges, he never lost faith in God. He never lost his trust in God. He never lost his belief in God. He never lost his relationship to God. He never lost any of his purity and saintliness. And we have till this day 2 amazing legacies from King David. We have the book of Psalms, which has maintained us through so many years of exile, knowing that through saying Psalms, we draw down God's kindness and compassion. And David poured himself into his Psalms. So when you're saying Psalms, every time you say Psalms, you're connecting to King David. And we have the seed. We have the seed of Mashiach. Because that was the idea from Rus, from Lot, from Moab, from Judah and Tamar, through Boaz, to Oved, to Yishai, to David, to Solomon. This is the energy. This is the seed of Mashiach. So when we have the complete revelation of Mashiach, that's the culmination of the legacy of David. And what the book that we study, this book of Rus, is really the base from which came forth that flowering legacy of David. So we finished. I was planning to do something else, but I don't know if we're going to have time. I don't think we're going to have time. But I wanted to, before I did anything else, ask. So we finished a whole work. Obviously, it was short. It's 4 chapters, but it's a work. It's one of the 24 books of scriptures. There's 24 books of Tanakh. understand the English scriptures, and this is one of the 24 books. So I think it's a nice accomplishment that we studied the entire work and studied it fundamentally and really worked through all the deep ideas in it. So what did you gain from it? Now that you have one book, depending on if you attended all the classes or not, somewhat inside of you, what did you see you gained? What lessons did you take from this work? What resonated inside of you?
I think what I gained that we should respect the people converted, to understand how difficult it is for them, and like value them, respect, honor.
That's definitely something we're supposed to walk away with. Many have the custom, it's not the Chabad, Lubavitch custom, but many have the custom actually of reading the book of Rus on Shavuos. And the reason is because it says that on Shavuos, with the giving of the Torah, all the Jews converted, so to speak. It's what's considered. They all converted to receive the Torah, converted to being Jews. And Rus is considered the ultimate convert, the prototype ultimate convert. So therefore, we read her story, the story of the ultimate convert, on the day celebrating all of our conversion to God. So yes, definitely that is a theme we're definitely supposed to walk away with, is that sensitivity and appreciation for what it means to be a convert. Thank you, Menucha. Anyone else? There's so many different lessons here. There's so many different things that you could have gained, and hopefully you did from this study. Anyone else, if you want to reflect on what your thoughts were as you were learning it?
Like you said, Cyril, there is a lot of lessons. It's hard to pinpoint like one, right? Like Menucha mentioned one, but there is also like in the beginning, we learned how the leaders of the people stay with people, and how important it is to God that righteous and leader, and but if you leave people, Hashem is not happy, right? So that's another big lesson of Jewish leadership and Jewish connection and sharing what you have with others.
That's
right?
huge. That's huge. That was a very big piece in the beginning of the book, that whole concept of how Elimelech and his sons abandoned the people and everything that happened as a result of that. And yes, that was definitely a huge, huge lesson in this work, is understanding that we don't abandon our brothers if they're in a hardship and we could escape. That's not our road. You know, there's in the Holocaust, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a very, very, very great Torah scholar. His name was, oh gosh, my brain's not working right now. I'm bad with names. I don't remember his name, but it'll come to me like maybe in a half an hour. A very, very great Torah scholar who lived during the Holocaust. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. Oh my gosh, now it's bothering me. What was his name? I can't even remember. Anyway, he was so great that the Catholic Church, of course, the Catholic Church was very strong in Poland. They sent a message into the ghetto that they were willing to smuggle him out. Like, they understood he was such a treasure, not just to the Jewish people, but to the world, because of his enormous knowledge of Torah, There were obviously many, many, many great Torah scholars and leaders of the Jewish people that were in the Warsaw Ghetto. But he, even among all of them, was considered like outstanding. So the Catholic Church sent him a message, we'll get you out. We'll hide you, we'll protect you. And he refused. He said, no, I'm not leaving my people. And he died in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's exactly, yeah, a living, you know, not as thousands of years ago, but exactly that lesson of like, he could have, and I'm not saying he would have been wrong if he did. That's not my point at all. It's not that it would have been wrong if he had. You know, obviously different leaders have different roles, but he knew for himself, he was supposed to stay with the people. Anyone else? Anything else that you're remembering now that struck you as we were learning? And as Chava said, there's so much. And I think if you just even think through it, all the different ideas we spoke about, there's so many ideas that were so powerful, especially because you're learning it literally textually from the text, not just hearing a story, but like hearing it verse by verse. Anything else that someone remembers that resonated in them?
I don't know how to say it right. This is Vega. I just want to say that God always, he always gets what he wants, no matter what, right? I mean, if people don't want to do his work, it will be probably somebody else, but
Yes.
no
yes.
matter what, there is no, like, it's always done the way it should be done, right?
God is masterminding the show.
Right. I don't know how to say that.
You are absolutely right.
beautiful.
And it is absolutely clear from this work exactly that point. And it's also very interesting, you know, Fagan, now that you're saying that, because going back to what Chava said, people made wrong choices. It's hand down was wrong of Elimelech to leave. There's not one person that whitewashes him. Nobody, obviously there's many different commentators and many different, but not one commentator gives him anything making him innocent. He was wrong. And yet his 100% wrong choice was also part of God's vision. He made this wrong choice. And his sons, Machlon and Chilion, also made a wrong choice. Remember, they only got married after Elimelech passed away. So they definitely, after their father died, should have turned back and gone back to Israel. So they continued and made a wrong choice. But that doesn't take away God from the picture. God knows what he's doing. God's part of the whole story. Well, what would have happened if they hadn't made those wrong choices? God would have figured out a different way. Don't worry. He's God. But even as people are doing things and people are making their choices and like, oh my gosh, look what's happening. How horrible. It's still God's thread is running through. 100% fake. I think that's a very, very, very strong theme that comes out. Very powerful thought.
I would like to share one more, a relationship between Ruth and Naomi. I think it's a very special lesson about respecting mother-in-law, parents, or like parents-in-law, mother-in-law in this case, like being dedicated and loyal and respectful and trust her wisdom. So there's a lot along those lines. Also, like we learned.
There is throughout, in both directions. It is a beautiful example to shatter all the stereotypes. You see, like you're saying, Ruth's loyalty. She wouldn't abandon her. Naomi said, go back to the palace, go back, get married, have kids. What are you coming with me for? Ruth wouldn't abandon her. And then when they came to Israel, Ruth went out. This is a princess. She's going out to the fields among the beggars to gather the grain, to bring it back for them. And she didn't want Naomi to go. Like, I mean, she knew it would be even more embarrassing for Naomi because everybody knew Naomi, like these were Naomi, everyone knew Naomi was, and Naomi knew them. Even more embarrassing. So she wanted to protect her mother-in-law, and she did it. And then, like you're saying, trusting her wisdom when Naomi comes up with this crazy plot to go in the middle of the night, which it sounds so like the opposite, the antithesis of how Ruth should have behaved. And Ruth was this paragon of modesty, but she trusted her. And then you see, like you're saying, you see at the end, which is also such a beautiful concept there, how all the women are saying, oh, Naomi got a child. Like the relationship was both ways. There was that such a closeness and such a love and such a respect that Ruth's child was Naomi's child. So it's a beautiful tribute to both of them and to what that relationship could be and should be. You're absolutely right. It is a very beautiful, strong, powerful lesson. Anyone else? Anything else that struck them?
I wanted to say that I think that her example, when she declared, your people will be my people and your God, my God, is such a beautiful example of commitment, of clarity, of conviction, loyalty. She's just, to me, a stunning example of those attributes. So resolute,
So resolute, right?
So very, very no space for anything else. Beautiful.
Yeah, and those words are very famous from the whole book. Those are probably the most famous words from the entire work. You hit on the most famous words, that the most quoted words from the whole book, because you're right, it just expresses so strongly. To me, something that, as you're saying, just struck me very strongly throughout was the sense of how, like, it seems so clearly that Ruth and Naomi, but let's just focus on Ruth, like she gave up so much for God. She could, like you're saying in this episode that Bathsheba was referring us to, this famous episode where Naomi's saying, go back home. You're, relatively speaking, a young woman. She wasn't that young. She was 40, but still, those days 40 was older than 40 is today. You can still get married. You go back to the palace. They'll take you in. They'll find you a husband. You can have kids. And she's like, no. And I was like, you're going to have nothing with me. I'm totally impoverished. I'm totally disgraced. People are going to be like, I'm a nobody. You'll never get married. Like what are you coming to this life with me of nothingness? And Ruth was loyal to Naomi and loyal to God. And it seemed like Ruth, like many people, okay, she made this huge sacrifice for God, and like, whatever, sad. She lost all hopes of having a good life. And probably, if we can imagine her friends back in Moab, we're like, oh, she really, went off her rocker there. She could have gone back to the palace. She could have gotten a good, eligible husband. And she's now going to be this beggar in Judah. But God came through. God came through for her. And yes, she was only married one night to Boaz, but she did have the most unbelievable, righteous husband that, of course, she's with for eternity above. And obviously, God took care of her financially through Boaz. And she became the mother of David and Solomon. She produced a line of great tzaddikim that are the leaders of the Jewish people until today. And she merited to see it. She saw her son Oved. She saw her son Yisra. She saw David. She saw Solomon. So like, she sacrificed so much for God, and God doesn't stay in debt. God came through, and so too for all of us. I don't know if we make that degree of sacrifice. I don't know if we get to see that degree of the follow through. We don't always merit to see what our deeds are creating, but he's loyal. Ruth was loyal. God's loyal. When we sacrifice for him, he always comes through. He always comes through for us. To me, that was very, very, very overt, very strong throughout this whole work. Anyone else? Anything else that struck someone? Jenny?
Yes, Miss Toren. For me, it's the way God picked the people. It's different from our standards. It's like at first I asked myself, why of all people, why Ruth? She's a Moabites. Why not a Jewish? And at the same time, I asked also, why David of all the people? She's the youngest. It should be the eldest, right, to be the king. But I realize also both of these people, they had the courage to do God's will. Like David, even he was, young and, not as big as other people, but he has the courage to fight the giants. And even Ruth, she has the courage, to go with Naomi. And like, there is a loyalty and the courage, like, she has to face, the Jewish people. And she did not, I mean, for me, let us say I'm not a Jewish and I go there, it's like, I would be afraid. I would be afraid of the judgment of, but she's not. She has this courage, to be with them, to live like them. So yeah, I would say, I started to think that God's standard, if you would think in a, in a broad way, it's perfect. It's not questionable. At first I questioned, but as I saw it, God's will is so perfect. Yeah, he
Such a
always
beautiful
picked
thing you're saying, Jenny.
the perfect people.
That's so beautiful what you're saying. It's so interesting. I think it sort of piggybacks on what Bathsheba said, like you're connecting it to David, like what Bathsheba said about Ruth, how resolute, how clear, how strong, and as you're saying, how courageous. She didn't know what the Jews' reception of her would be. This Moabite convert, Moab is our enemy. And what you're saying is these same characteristics followed through to David. And you're right, they did. That, as what I was saying, that resolute, that clear, knowing what's what. And that's why you're going to let Goliath just blaspheme God and curse and use such blasphemous expressions on the Jewish people? If there's no one else that's going to stand up to him, I will. I don't care. I could take on him with a slingshot and 5 rocks. What difference does it make? If God wants, I'll win anyway. It doesn't make a difference. God could do anything. And that, like you're saying, that courage and that clarity and that conviction of Ruth, definitely we see embodied in David. That's I never thought of that connection, but you're right. It's very, very strong, very strong. And you're right. That's what we need to emulate, because we also need courage for our convictions. Saying Ruth had the courage in her convictions, and David had the courage in his convictions, and we need to have the courage in our convictions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on pieces that affected them? Sorry for all my ringing phones. Okay, well, I hope everyone will reflect. I wanted to do this to create the opportunity for us to reflect on what we studied and to sort of see how much we gained. There's so much there, and what Menucha said, and Chava, and Fega, and Bathsheba, and Jenny, all these things. And there's more and more and more and more, honestly. There's, like Chava said, there was so much. It was 4 chapters with every class we met. I felt there was so much, what I call practical application. There was so much that felt so relevant and so current. So as you reflect and think back, to really realize that everything in Torah is supposed to be Torah. The word Torah is from the word hora'ah, which means instruction, a teaching, a lesson. It's probably the best way to translate it, a lesson. And everything in Torah is supposed to be a lesson for us in our life, meaning we're never, ever, ever supposed to read Torah as like a history book, as a historical narrative. We're always supposed to read it as the current practical lesson for me, how I'm supposed to live. And what everyone said now were practical applications, practical lessons in my living a higher level life through all the lessons embedded in this work, to relationships with people, like Chava was saying, to our perspective on the convert as Menucha, to our own resolute courage and understanding of how God is working throughout. All of these things help me live a life today. That's what Torah is supposed to teach me. Not history, but today, how I'm supposed to live. And as Chava said, there's more and more and more and more lessons we could pull out. So maybe let it like sink through your brains. Just think of those things that were meaningful, to like commit to them, to like think about them in a way of like taking them into your heart. So we did finish, which means next week we're gonna do something different. But to now continue with the laws of Shabbos, it's one law now. So our sages instituted that a person should light in his house a candle as a means of ushering in the Shabbos. Now, why a candle? What did they say was the reason? Because the light of the candle is bringing peace into the home. So as we're lighting the candle, it's to usher in the Shabbos and usher in the peace. Now, of course, that could be meant on a very simple, practical level. In those days, they didn't have electricity. So if you didn't have a light burning, people could stumble and trip and fall, and there could be a lot of problems. But it's also meant on many other levels as well, because really every mitzvah is a light. The verse says, "Ner mitzvah v'Torah or." The mitzvah is the candle, Torah is light. So every single time we serve God and do His will, there's a light shining in the world, but we don't see it. It's a spiritual light. But when we light the candles for Shabbos and for the holidays, it's like that spiritual light is so strong, it came down to a physical reality. So that light that's shining from our candles is reflecting the spiritual light of the Shabbos entering the home. So when you light those lights, you're supposed to literally feel, if you're sensitized to it, peace. The peace of Shabbos entering into your heart as you light those candles. And it says that even someone who's very poor and therefore doesn't have money to light a candle, he's supposed to collect charity to light that candle in honor of the Shabbos. So this injunction of the sages has two parts. The obligation to light the candle, or a person doesn't have to personally light it. If it's in a home, someone else is lighting it, that he's participating in that. And that the place where people are for Shabbos should have a candle lit, meaning it works in both directions. Both, you should light a candle, and the place where you are should have a candle burning. Now, of course, this mitzvah primarily, so you could say, well, the sages said to light a candle. Hey, you can light it anywhere. You can put it in your bedroom, you can put it anywhere in the house. But primarily, we place the candles by the table where we're eating the Shabbos foods. And we want to make sure actually that this candle is as beautiful as possible. Meaning we're supposed to be very meticulous, very careful in this commandment. You could say it's just one little commandment ushering the Shabbos that has like tens and tens of laws and commandments. There's so many commandments that have to do with the Shabbos, and that's true. But for some reason, this commandment is, how should I put it, very precious to God. For some reason, there's something very special about lighting the candle that brings in the Shabbos. And therefore, we're told we're supposed to be very careful with it. So careful that make it as beautiful as possible. We should have the table covered, ideally with a white tablecloth. Ideally, the table set. The candle should be ideally in a beautiful container and a beautiful candlestick. Ideally, we want to light as early as possible. We want to give charity before we light. We're doing all these things around the mitzvah because the mitzvah is a very precious mitzvah. It's very precious that we're taking the spiritual light and bringing it down, that in a physical way, our house is infused with the light of the Shabbos, with the light of the Sabbath. It says, whoever's careful about this commandment will merit to have children that are Torah scholars, because Torah is a light. So when we're careful with the light of Shabbos, this helps illuminate our children with the light of Torah. Now, we only have to light the candle in one place, and ideally we're supposed to light it where we eat. But we are also supposed to make sure that every room is illuminated. that we shouldn't trip and stumble and fall and all such things. Now, obviously nowadays that's very easy because we have electric lights. So it's not a big deal. In previous times, it was much more of a big deal to make sure throughout the Shabbos, when you're not allowed to light any fire, all the rooms were illuminated. But now it's not such a big deal for us. But we want that all the rooms that people, it doesn't mean like your basement, if you're not going into it, has to have the light burning on Shabbos. But all the rooms that people would use should have lights burning, that because of Shabbos, you can't light a candle, you can't strike a match, you can't turn on an electric light. So we want before Shabbos, all the lights should be set, that wherever a person goes, there'll be light. Any questions on those halachas, on those laws?
Yes, I have a question. What about bedroom?
So in the bedroom, the person sort of has to make a choice on what's best for them. What some people do for that, Chava, is if they have a closet that has a light, they might leave a light on in their closet. And then if they don't want the light, they can close the doors to the closet so the room's dark. But if they need the light, they could open it up. Other people don't want to do that or don't have lights in their closet. So they can leave the light on in the hall. And they could there, again, open the door so the light comes in and they don't trip. Close it when they want it dark. Some people have lamps in their room for that reason. Like there's all different schemes people do. But yes, a person has to figure out what's my comfort level of darkness, what's my comfort level for light. Some people use timers, but I don't think most people use timers in their bedroom. It would be too hard to figure exactly the time. So they probably don't. I don't use a timer, but I'm saying I don't think people really do that in their bedroom anyway. But yeah, nowadays they have this thing called a Shabbos lamp. Different people do different things for exactly that reason. Absolutely.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. So thank you so much for joining tonight. And whatever the lessons that were stated tonight, any beautiful ideas were stated or that you thought of but didn't share, or you might think of afterwards, like that sage's name is going to come to me in a minute or two. Just take it into your heart, because as we learned, there's something there for each one of us that we're supposed to walk away with. Thank you so much for joining. You should have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.